Part 1. Arrival in the Shadow Zone. August 15, 1944. The Pacific Ocean stretched out endless and leaden gray. The transport ship, making its way through the agitated waters, seemed to be drilling into the very core of the fog. Japanese women and children evacuated from China were crowded on its deck, which was flooded with salt spray. Their thin, tattered kimonos and dresses clung to their bodies, unable to protect them from the biting wind. They whispered prayers, clutching paper cranes in their numb fingers, ancient symbols of hope and longevity that now seemed as fragile as their own lives. These women, have been taught since childhood that Americans are not people, but monsters in human form. School teachers, newspapers, and posters all screamed the same thing. The Yankees were killing, raping, torturing, and starving prisoners. They were preparing for the worst. They were preparing to be beaten, humiliated, and slowly starved to death in filthy, rat-infested barracks. Yasuko Tanaka, a former teacher from Tokyo, clutched her precious handbag to her chest, which contained the latest photos of her daughter Mako, who stayed with her grandmother in Kyoto. The thought that Mako might become an orphan, and her last memory of her mother would be associated with shame and pain, made her heart clench into a lump of icy horror. When the ship finally docked, and they were escorted through a deserted area to a camp surrounded by barbed wire, this horror reached its climax. But when the gates clanged open, something completely unthinkable appeared before their eyes. Instead of the brutal guards with batons, they were met by soldiers with stern but not cruel faces. And then something happened that turned their world upside down. The guards, without saying a word, began handing them aluminum trays. On these trays were round buns, divided in half with a juicy patty inside, strange golden slices, and thick brown pate. There were also glass bottles with a dark, fizzing liquid that made you feel cold, and on the label of which was a name familiar to the whole world: Coca-Cola. One of the women, a young Fumiko who used to work as a clerk at Yokohama City Hall, stared at her tray in mute shock. "Hamburgers. And Coca-Cola," she whispered as if she were saying a word from a fairy tale. "Is this a trap? Are they trying to poison us?" Yasuko, still numb with fear, picked up her bottle. The legendary American drink. It's a symbol of the decaying capitalism they've been told about for so long. It was icy, and drops of condensation ran down the glass like tears. She opened the lid with a creak and took a small sip. A sharp, sweet hiss hit the sky, playing on the tongue with thousands of needles. It tasted like nothing she had ever tasted before, a taste that could not be associated with evil. And then a young guard came up to her, a sergeant with the name O'Connor on his chest. In his hands was not a baton, but a small sewing box. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, pointing to a small hole in the sleeve of her kimono. "You might find it useful." They were preparing for torture, starvation, and death. Instead, they were addressed as Mrs. and Miss. Instead of batons, they were given needles and threads. How could the enemy show such kindness? This question was in the air, mixing with the smell of fried meat and sugary soda, creating a stunning, incredible reality. Part 2. The Incredible Reality Routine. The morning began not with screams, but with the soft hum of the generator and the smell of freshly brewed coffee from the security canteen. The sun, not floodlights, broke through the chain links of the fence, illuminating the neat rows of barracks. Yasuko Tanaka, 3 weeks later, found her strange solace in the garden. He was defeated by the forces of the internees themselves on the initiative of the same Sergeant O'Connor, who once remarked that the earth heals the soul better than any medicine. She was kneeling by the lettuce bed, her fingers, accustomed to holding chalk, now working gently with the dark, moist earth. Next to her, in the next garden, Keiko Matsuda, the most ardent skeptic of their group, was suspiciously digging around radish sprouts. Keiko, who had lost her husband in the early skirmishes in the Philippines, carried a constant, burning anger like a splinter. "Why are they doing this?" Keiko asked softly in Japanese without looking at Yasuko. "First the food, now the garden. Are they trying to fatten us up like cattle before slaughtering us? Or are they just mocking you?" Yasuko didn't have time to reply. Sergeant O'Connor was approaching them. Keiko tensed, her back straight as a string. "Mrs. Tanaka," he said to Yasuko, and as always, it made her shudder. In his hands was a wooden box. "I thought you ladies might like this for the garden." There were new gardening tools in the drawer. Small shovels, rakes, rippers. Their metal shone like silver in the sun. Keiko couldn't stand it. She stood up and, looking directly at O'Connor, asked in broken English, "Why? Why are you giving us this?" O'Connor was not embarrassed. He met her gaze with the calm, tired eyes of a seasoned soldier. "A garden grows better with good tools, ma'am," he replied simply. "My mother always said, you can't expect much from a plant if you don't give it what it needs." This simple answer, devoid of any pathos or hidden meaning, seemed to disarm Keiko. She didn't say anything, just silently took a small ripper from the drawer and returned to her garden. Her movements were still sharp, but there was a hint of thoughtfulness in them. Later, during dinner, the conversation turned to food again. Midori Saiki, the mother of 2 young sons, as always, put aside half of her portion of white bread, carefully wrapping it in a handkerchief. "Mom, we're full," Hiroshi, her youngest, pleaded, his cheeks noticeably rounded in recent weeks. "Shut up," Midori said softly. "This bread, he's like a cloud. We must protect him. We don't know how long it will last." Fumiko, a former clerk, was spreading peanut butter on bread with awe. "She is? It's both sweet and salty," she whispered as if making a scientific discovery. "I've never eaten anything like this." How did they come up with such a thing? Yasuko was thinking about her letter to Mako at the time. How can I describe this paradox? How can I tell my daughter that their guards, these bloodthirsty monsters, brought real, undiluted milk to the children every day? That meat was not a rare, festive luxury here, but became part of the daily diet. Every word in the letter was censored, and she chose them with the care of a jeweler, afraid to seem like a traitor. "Dear Mako, we are well fed here," she wrote, and these simple words seemed to her a terrible betrayal of everything she believed in. The afternoon hours were reserved for English lessons. O'Connor somehow got hold of a real chalkboard and several boxes of chalk. The irony of the situation did not escape Yasuko. She, a teacher from Japan, was teaching her compatriots the enemy's language. But women, especially young ones, absorbed knowledge with avidity. "Please, thank you, may I?" These words fell on a new, strange reality. But when it came to the phrase, "I am grateful," there was an awkward silence in the classroom. "Grateful?" Keiko asked in pure Japanese, and her voice trembled. "Sensei, isn't that a sin? Don't you feel hate when you're treated like a human being? Aren't we betraying the memory of our fallen husbands and brothers by accepting this one? This grace?" This question, heavy and uncomfortable, hung in the air. There was no answer to it. They were ready for torture and starvation. They knew how to respond to them, with dignity and silent resistance. But they were not prepared for the portions that filled their bowls, for the medical care that their coughing children received, for the guards who respectfully stepped aside as they walked down the corridor. This kindness was a weapon they had no defense against. In the evening, while preparing small thank you notes to hand over to the guards, another unthinkable tradition they had adopted, Yasuko wrote carefully in Japanese and English. The words seemed to her like a bridge between 2 worlds that, as she believed, could never coexist. On the one hand, everything she was taught. On the other hand, there was this overwhelming reality of hamburgers on real plates, Coca-Cola sizzling on her lips, and men calling her Mrs., as if her dignity meant something to them. She folded the note with her hands, which were no longer shaking as much as on that first day. Perhaps, she thought, the most dangerous thing about this place wasn't the guards or the fences. Perhaps it was hope itself, quietly growing in the fertile soil of unexpected mercy. Part 3. The scent of freedom and the sounds of someone else's happiness. The 4th of July brought with it a wave of suffocating heat, which rose from the concrete paths of the camp in a trembling haze. But inside the dining room, the dreary government room was transformed. Red, white, and blue garlands hung everywhere, and long tables overflowed with food that seemed to be the product of a collective madness or miracle. Yasuko stood with the other women in line, watching as the camp staff set out giant trays of hamburgers, bowls of potato salad, ears of corn glistening with butter, and batteries of Coca-Cola bottles sweating in metal ice buckets. "Is this a dream?" Fumiko whispered, and her eyes seemed about to pop out of her head. "They say it's their Independence Day," Keiko translated softly for those who didn't understand. "Holiday. They want us to join them." The invitation sounded surreal. Midori hugged her sons to her. Hiroshi, however, was no longer afraid. He was looking curiously at the bustling American soldiers, and one of them, a red-haired kid with freckles, winked at him. The boy shyly buried his face in his mother's skirt. Sergeant O'Connor appeared. There was a hint of genuine warmth in his usual restrained courtesy today. "Lady, please help yourself. There's plenty of everything here." Yasuko was really shocked by the first bite of the burger. The meat was juicy, with smoke, with unfamiliar herbs, and the bun was incredibly soft. She had eaten beef maybe 3 times in her life before the war, and never anything like it. Around her, other women were also taking their first cautious bites, and their faces were gradually changing from tired and wary to amazed. But the real revelation was Coca-Cola again. The first sip caused gasps of surprise, sharp sweetness, playful bubbles, tickling the tongue. Keiko suddenly laughed. A short, low laugh, but it was a laugh. A sound that seemed to have left this camp forever. "It tastes like happiness," she said in Japanese, and then, searching for words, repeated to O'Connor, "Tastes like joy." He smiled, and his weathered face was covered with new wrinkles. "That's right, ma'am." As the day wore on, the ice of distrust continued to melt. A small camp band, guitar, harmonica, and banjo played folk tunes. When the song "She'll Be Comin' Round the Mountain" started playing, Keiko involuntarily started singing along, quietly translating the words for the others. And then there was a moment that Yasuko remembered forever. Little Hiroshi went up to the same freckled guard and, pointing to the shiny buttons on his uniform, muttered something quickly in Japanese. "He says, are they gold?" Keiko translated. The young soldier, without hesitation, squatted down to be on the same level with the boy. He unfastened one of the brass buttons and placed it in Hiroshi's small palm. "Tell him it's not gold, but let him keep it," he said, looking at Midori. Midori had tears in her eyes, which she immediately wiped away. This gesture, simple, human, devoid of any politics, was stronger than all the propaganda leaflets in the world. Back in the barracks, the women carried more than just satiety. They carried an impossible, unbearable weight of joy that they did not expect to feel again. Yasuko found herself humming an American tune. In her cramped room, she opened her notebook. "My dear Mako," she began, "today I tasted America, and it was nothing like the bitter poison they used to scare us with." She paused, the pencil poised over the paper. How could she explain to her daughter that their enemies had shown them more kindness in 2 months than their own government had shown them in the last year of the war? Outside the window, The last sounds of a harmonica floated over the camp, carrying with them the seditious thought that mercy can bloom in the most unexpected places. Part 4. A Ruined World and Ashes in the Heart. The news came on a Tuesday morning in August, and it was brought by the camp administrator, whose face was distorted by the weight of words too heavy for ordinary speech. Yasuko was just teaching her English class when he appeared at the door, his clipboard shaking slightly in his hands. "Lady," he began, and paused, clearing his throat. "The war is over. Japan has surrendered." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Keiko slowly stood up, and the creak of her chair on the concrete floor sounded like a gunshot. "Capitulated," she repeated in English, and then switched to Japanese, and her voice was scary in its calmness. "Nihon ga makata." No, Japan lost. But it was the second part of the news that shattered them. 2 cities were wiped off the face of the earth by weapons beyond imagination. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. These names fell from the administrator's lips like stones falling into stagnant water, and the spreading circles of horror engulfed the gathered women. Fumiko collapsed into a chair, her notebook fell to the floor, the pages scattered like fallen leaves. Her sister lived in Hiroshima and worked at a textile factory near the city center. The mathematical precision of her grief was terrible. She calculated the distance to the factory, the shift schedule, and the likelihood that one of her relatives was still breathing. In the following days, the camp acquired the quality of a funeral hall. The women, who were learning to laugh again, became silent. Hamburgers and Coca-Cola, which once seemed like a gift, now looked like a mockery. How could they afford to rejoice while their homeland was burning? Yasuko couldn't bring herself to write in her diary. The pages remained blank, and her thoughts turned to ashes. Was her acceptance of American kindness a betrayal of all who suffered? This question circled in her mind like a vulture. Every act of mercy on the part of the guards now seemed tainted by the knowledge of what other American hands were capable of. Hiroshi, Midori's youngest son, was still clutching the brass button that the guard had given him, but now he was hiding it under his pillow, as if it contained some shameful secret. His mother looked at him with empty eyes, her maternal instinct struggling with a grief too vast to comprehend. How do you explain to a child that the very nation that fed him ice cream turned 2 cities into shadows and smoke? On the 3rd day after the news, the arguments began. Harsh whispers in the dining room, accusations that cut deeper than any physical injury. "We let them drug us with this food," one of the women hissed. "We've forgotten who we are." "Were we supposed to starve to death because of their bombs?" the other retorted. "These soldiers have nothing to do with it. They are the same people as us." Keiko stopped translating songs. Instead, she sat by the fence and stared through the links of the chain at the horizon, beyond which lay only uncertainty. When O'Connor approached with his usual deference, she turned away without deigning to look at him. The bridge of understanding that they had built with careful words and small gestures collapsed under the weight of nuclear fire. One evening, Yasuko was sitting in her room with her diary open. The blank page mocked her inability to comprehend the contradictions that had become her life. How could the same people who called her Mrs. and gave her chalk to study have the power to wipe out entire cities? How could mercy and destruction flow from the same source? She picked up the pencil and then put it down again. Outside the window, Sergeant O'Connor's footsteps could be heard making his evening rounds. His steps were as measured and respectful as ever, but now they carried a different burden, a reminder that kindness and disaster can wear the same uniform, speak the same language, and salute the same flag. The notebook remained empty as darkness enveloped the camp, and with it came a terrible realization. Some truths are too complex for simple words, too vast for the small consolation of written testimony. The war was over, But understanding what it means to find humanity in unexpected places was just beginning. Part 5. Slow Rebirth and Memory. Ink silence, thick and impenetrable as smog, hung over the camp for 5 long days. Yasuko refused to eat anything except water and rice. Her body rejected what seemed to her to be complicity in the celebration of destruction. Around her, other women moved like ghosts, carrying out their daily routines, their faces burdened with the burden of unanswered questions. Nurse Rebecca was the first to break through this despair. She appeared at Yasuko's bedside on a gray morning when the August heat finally receded. The American woman was about 40 years old. Her graying hair was tightly pinned up, and her eyes had seen so much suffering that they had learned to recognize it unmistakably in others. In her hands, she held a plain brown notebook with a battered cover. "Mrs. Tanaka," she said softly, sitting down in a chair next to the cot. "I know that you kept notes before all of this." She waved her hand vaguely towards the window, embracing both atomic bombs and surrender in one gesture. "My grandmother kept a diary during the flu epidemic. She said it was the only way to make sense of life in conditions that defied comprehension." Yasuko turned away, but Nurse Rebecca continued, and in her voice sounded the firm confidence of a person accustomed to healing. She wrote about neighbors who were dying and neighbors who brought soup, about doctors who saved lives, and about undertakers who inflated prices, about human beings remaining human beings, which means that they are capable of everything at once. The notebook lay between them like a bridge that neither woman was ready to cross. "Your daughter needs to know that her mother survived," Rebecca finally said. "She needs to know what it was like to survive. Not only the big story, but also the small moments, the truth." And so, on the same day, Yasuko held a new notebook in her hands. Her blank pages were both frightening and full of hope. She began not with loud statements or political analyses, but with memories of Hiroshi's face when he tasted ice cream for the first time. The delight in his eyes was pure, unblemished knowledge of what would happen later. This moment was real, no matter what kind of atomic fire followed it. Slowly, like the first shoots after a fire, other women began to emerge from their cocoons of grief. Keiko started humming again. Not American folk songs, but traditional Japanese melodies that seemed to connect her to something deeper than politics or nationality. When one of the young guards asked about the meaning of the song, she translated not with the same suspicion, but with the tired patience of a man who realized that understanding requires effort on both sides. Midori allowed her sons to play with other children again, although she watched over them with fierce protection. When Hiroshi showed his brass button to a new friend, she didn't take it back. Instead, she helped him polish it until it sparkled in his palm like a small sun. "The kindness you've been shown is still kindness," she told Yasuko one evening, even if the hands that held it out did terrible things. Preparations for repatriation began in early September, a slow process of paperwork and medical examinations that would bring them back to Japan, which they could no longer imagine. Gathering her meager possessions, Yasuko carefully wrapped the notebook in a clean handkerchief. Her pages now held fragments of truth too valuable to lose. The taste of hamburgers, the sound of children laughing, the sight of guards choosing restraint over brutality, even when their nation chose devastation over honor. On their last night, Sergeant O'Connor showed up at the women's barracks with a small cardboard box. Inside, neatly wrapped in tissue paper, were glass bottles of Coca-Cola, still cold. "I thought you might want to remember," he said simply, handing them out with the same dignity he had shown throughout their imprisonment. Yasuko picked up her bottle. She was solid and real, a tangible reminder that complexity can coexist with compassion, that human beings contain a multiplicity too vast for simple judgments. She would take her home to Mako, along with the notebook and the incredible story she kept. Part 6. Return to Another World, and the burden of hope. The ship that was supposed to take them home cut through the waters of the Pacific Ocean, reflecting the sky the color of old tin. Yasuko stood at the rail with her modest bundle, where a bottle of Coca-Cola was carefully wrapped next to the diary. Both treasures seemed to belong to another life, although only days had passed since their appearance. The Japan they were returning to existed only in scraps of letters and rumors passed on by Red Cross staff. Destroyed cities, scattered families, the entire nation bowed under the weight of surrender and occupation. The disembarkation process was chaotic, held back only by haggard officials who handled the returnees with mechanical efficiency. Yasuko lost sight of the other women in the maze of paperwork and medical examinations. Her bundle was searched and rewrote. The young clerk was looking at the Coca-Cola bottle with curiosity and suspicion. "What's that for?" he asked. "Memory," Yasuko replied simply, and something in her tone must have convinced him, because he carefully wrapped the bottle and put it back without asking any more questions. The trip to Kyoto became a journey through landscapes scarred by the scars of war, like old wounds that were just beginning to heal. At the small stations, Yasuko caught glimpses of American soldiers overseeing reconstruction work alongside Japanese workers. There was the same careful politeness in their interactions that she had seen in the camp. Her daughter Mako was waiting for her at the train station in Kyoto. She was taller than Yasuko remembered, and her clothes had obviously been darned many times. But there was the same bright intelligence in her eyes that always made Yasuko's heart ache with pride. When they hugged, the months of separation collapsed in an instant of pure reunion. "O Kayarinasai," Mako whispered into her mother's shoulder. "Welcome home." That evening, in the small room they now shared with Yasuko's mother-in-law, Mako watched with admiration as her mother unpacked her bundle. The sewing kit provided by Sergeant O'Connor drew approving comments from the older woman, who acknowledged the quality of the threads as excellent. But the diary caught Mako's attention the most. "Did you write all this at the camp?" "What is it?" she asked, flipping through the pages with reverent care. "Every day at the end," Yasuko replied. "I wanted you to know what really happened. Not what others can tell, but the truth. The whole truth." As Mako read, her expression changed from surprise to dismay, and finally to understanding mixed with amazement. Yes, there were hamburgers and Coca-Cola, but there were also guards who called her mother Mrs., while her own government reduced her to a room. Here was the whole difficulty of finding grace in captivity, when cities turned to ashes, accepting kindness from those whose nation had brought unimaginable destruction. Years later, when Mako had her own children, she read them excerpts from her grandmother's diary, not to forgive or forget the horrors of war, but to remember that even in the darkest chapters of human history, individual souls can choose mercy instead of hatred, dignity instead of revenge, hope instead of despair. A Coca-Cola bottle, long empty but carefully preserved, stood on their shelf as evidence of the possibility that enemies can become a source of unexpected grace, and a heart capable of surviving war can embrace peace.